What is going on, you guys? Admiral Tori here, and welcome aboard for another World of Warship video on my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showcasing the Tier 7 Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hiryu. Now, aircraft carriers. This is going to be my first aircraft carrier video on my channel, so right away I can tell you guys that I'm not the greatest aircraft carrier player out there, but I definitely enjoy the RTS style of play. In terms of gameplay, I do have a recorded game, which is probably one of the best game I have ever played on World of Warships, and if not one of the best aircraft carrier experience I had with the Hiryu. So the Hiryu is one of the best aircraft carriers during her time. She was released around the 1930s before World War II started in the Pacific, which was December 7th, 1941, after the decisive attack by the Japanese Navy, which was planned out by Yamamoto, who was the famous commander in World War II, considered one of the top fleet commanders in general in terms of all other commanders. There are Nimitz and other commanders I probably don't know, but I only know Nimitz and Yamamoto because those two were pretty much playing a game of chess in the Pacific. When it comes to aircraft carriers, I do have a passion for them because in the Pacific theater, I think the number one ship that everyone wants to focus in the Pacific theater is aircraft carriers. Battleships, that was really World War I, and that was a long time ago. Destroyers, maybe destroyers too, because destroyers are the front lines, and I hear a lot of stories about the Fletcher class. A lot of people, family who actually served in World War II during the naval engagement tend to be in the Fletcher class, so Fletcher being one of the popular destroyers. But in general, the Pacific theater, when it comes to stories, I don't think any story can surpass aircraft carriers. From my experience, from what I hear about and what has happened during Pacific, we hear all about it. The kamikazes, the dogfighting, the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, which is probably my most favorite battle in World War II. I know for a fact there is other battles that are up there like Stalingrad or the Battle of the Bulge, I think that's what's called, when the Soviets were pushing the Germans, Iwo Jima. But the Battle of Midway was a turning table for the Pacific warfare, and it was the key battle that really led the Japanese to their death. So the Battle of Midway happens like about 6 months after World War II started in the Pacific, and the Hiryu, which is the carrier that is featured today, happens to be one of the ships that were involved. So if you guys don't know anything about the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Midway basically should have been won by the Japanese. The Japanese were having air supremacy throughout the war for about 6 months, a total of 6 months before the Battle of Midway, which happened around June 4th. So the Japanese have so many experienced pilots in terms of dogfighting, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers compared to the United States of America, who just entered the war from, enduring the Great Depression, only got a couple of aircraft carriers, and their Pacific fleet being devastated after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They didn't really have much to start out with, but the Battle of Midway was a very important battle, and there are many books about the Battle of Midway, like The Miracle at Midway, The Shattered Sword. But basically, if the Japanese were able to win the Battle of Midway and sink what was left of the United States aircraft carrier fleet, which were present during the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States might have to surrender to the Japanese or sign a new treaty to renegotiate diplomatic relationships. And the story goes all the way back to how the imperialist leader didn't really bring the letter to the emperor about how the Japanese want to go to war with the United States. But in that case, the United States wanted to have a negotiation treaty, but it didn't go so well, obviously. So the Battle of Midway, if the Japanese actually won the Battle of Midway, theoretically from many historical experts or historians, they say that the Japanese would be able to actually push to the California fronts or the Nevada fronts, but not really conquer the United States. But the United States have no point of actually fighting the Japanese after losing their fleet. But there's other ways around of actually winning the war, so it's not just the Battle of Midway. Even if the Japanese won the Battle of Midway, there are chances from the United States that can actually defeat the Japanese. But the Battle of Midway was a very important battle because after the Battle of Midway, the Hiryu, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were sunk. And this was pretty much 2/3 of the Japanese fleet, or rather known as the Kido Butai, because the Japanese started with around 10 aircraft carriers and they earned such high superiority over the Americans. They had the Japanese Zero, they have torpedo bombers that are capable of actually sinking battleships, and the United States, they just didn't know where to start before the industry kicked in to build more aircraft carriers. Say for instance the Essex class, which they end up building 26 of those, the Midway, the Lexington or the Yorktown carriers, Enterprise. Basically those carriers are the legend. So back to the Hiryu. The Hiryu was sunk in 1942, which was in the Battle Midway. So she was one of the other carriers that were sunk in the Midway. The carriers that weren't sunk in Midway but should have been in Midway were the Shokagu and the Zuikaku, and that could have turned the battle around. But I'm not going to go in depth with the battle. I'm going to talk about the ship instead, because I think the ship has a very interesting legend. So before we even talk about the legend, actually, let's look at the ship itself. I think the Hiryu is probably my most favorite looking aircraft carrier, and probably one of the most fun aircraft carrier to play on World of Warship due to her loadout, her types of plane, and her tier. For being tier 7, she is pretty much a easy to go rather than the higher tier carriers which you spend a long time queuing up for due to the small population of carriers, and the lower tier carriers like the tier 5 and 6, they're just too slow. The planes are just too slow to get to their target. The Hiryu is really the middle point, so it's not too difficult with the higher tiers, but the planes are not that crappy compared to the lower tiers, so it is actually enjoyable. So the gameplay I actually have will showcase how these planes actually operate. So the first plane we want to look at is the famous Japanese Mitsubishi A6M2, which was engineered by a man named Jiro. Jiro was a genius for the Japanese engineer. If it weren't for him, then probably not many dogfighting expert would come out of World War II for the Japanese, and maybe not even possible to even consider war against the United States. But the Japanese Zero has earned a reputation because the Navy, which went out to the Mitsubishi, the Nakajima, and all the other airplane companies in Japan, they asked them for a new fighter, and what was amazing about it was that their specification was really unreal at the time. It was supposed to be fast, loaded with huge cannons on there, which is like pretty much the bigger bullet, but they call it cannons, and there's machine guns on it. But the fighter, it was impossible to build it at first, but the Japanese Mitsubishi company were able to achieve it mainly due to the fact that it had no armor. So the Japanese Zero at the time earned its name after fighting against the Soviet planes and the Chinese planes during the Sino-Japanese War, which was really the World War II conflict in the Pacific. But historians consider, or actually Westerners consider, World War II started in 1939 after Germany invaded Poland and France. But I think World War II actually started in China in 1937, or maybe earlier. There may be other wars, but the Japanese invaded China to expand their empire, and this was a common thing because there's the British Empire, there's the United States Empire, which a lot of people don't realize, but the United States got an empire from the Spanish-American War in the early 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt. But back to the idea. The Japanese pilot has earned so much experience, tactics, that they love the Japanese Zero. The first model of Zero, which was the A6M0 or M1, which had a problem with pretty much the test pilot. The problem was that the test pilot actually died in the process. But the M2, I believe, is probably the perfected version for the Japanese Zero. There were other models for the Japanese Zero like the M3, and there's the A7M, I believe, on the Shokaku. Let's see the Shokaku. Yeah, the A7M1, which is a better version of the A6, because the A6 has some major flaws in order to achieve the specification. The most notable feature about the Zero is its maneuverability. A lot of pilots during the World War II, which were in the Mustangs or the Avengers or Corsair, when they were fighting against the Japanese A6M, which was pretty much outdated by 1943 or 42 because of its weak armor and some other flaws that the Americans figured out, and they developed tactics to deal with the Zero. But the Zero was able to maintain air supremacy for the first 6 months and then equal turns for the rest of the 1942 into 43, when the Americans has developed the Essex class carrier and then come up with better fighters, bigger engine, better armor, better guns or whatever it is to outclass the Zero. But the Zero, she has earned a legend really, and it is one of my most favorite fighters in World War II. I think she is really a beautiful plane also. So Japanese Zero, she's on the Hiryu. Can't get better than that. Now the torpedo bomber, which is the Nakajima B5N2, I read a little things about them. These torpedo bombers were used during the Pearl Harbor raid, so I guess they can be famous for that. And they're way better than the Ryujo torpedo bomber, which had like a double wing, looking plane. If you guys are curious what it looks like, I have it right here. This is the previous tier. Yeah, that is a major upgrade in terms of design and the way it looks. So they're pretty nice. The dive bomber, which is the Aichi D3A2, I haven't looked that much into dive bombers, but I think they're pretty cool looking planes, and they pretty much fly faster than torpedo bombers, which is probably what you expect if you play carrier. So the slowest plane are the torpedo bombers for having a heavy load. The second slowest will be the Aichi dive bombers, and the fastest planes are the fighters for those people out there who don't know anything about aircraft carriers. Overall, the aircraft carrier had a reputation for being powerful, and this was one of the newer generation of aircraft carriers, because the Japanese were building aircraft carriers like crazy before they started a war with the United States. Always want to be prepared before you even do anything, and basically the Shokaku is the bigger version of the Hiryu. The Soryu was the smaller version of the Hiryu, but I think the Soryu was the first design to have this type of looking deck. Now, one notable feature on the Hiryu that I like compared to any other carriers on Water Warship, and maybe the ship in general, is the Hinomaru symbol on the carrier. And you're probably wondering, what the hell is a Hinomaru? The Hinomaru is the red dot, and that represents the Japanese flag, or rather the rising sun. And I think that's a pretty cool feature on Water Warship, other than having the flag on every other ships. But this is a pretty cool symbol. The Japanese put this on there so they can represent their fleet, and the fleet, as we know, as Kido Butai, which was the first air fleet, that consists of the Akagi, the Kaga, the Ryujo, the Shokaku, Zuikaku, the Soryu, a lot of aircraft carriers, and they were considered the best aircraft carriers in the world at their time in the 1930s. Now, many will argue the British, maybe the Americans, but at that time, the Japanese, like I said, they gained a lot of experience from fighting the Chinese and Soviets, and they actually win a lot of the fights. One of the ratios for the Japanese Zero, when the pilots started using the Zero, was that every 1 Zero that gets shot down by the Chinese or the Soviet plane, the Japanese Zero was able to take down 12 of their plane. So that gives you a good idea. Remember, the key feature is that it has fast speed, very, very fast plane, and is very maneuverable. So its only weakness is really some maneuverability problems in terms of rolling, I think, to the right or diving up and down. It's got to do with the engine. I read a little thing about it, but the armor is the biggest flaw, and the fuel ceiling, which was not a priority for the Japanese, and that was key to the Japanese losing the war, because they lacked the technology for actually sealing their fuel, and it was pretty much a technique that the United States, America, and the British actually used a lot, and that prevent their planes from dying too fast. So you ever see a kamikaze or any documentary about Japanese fighters against Americans, whenever the Americans shoot down the Japanese fighters, you will see their tails go on fire a lot because of their failure to actually seal the fuel tank. So that's one thing that the Japanese Zero had a huge problem with, which was addressed in the B7, because the B7 had a bigger engine, much more armor, and the A7, why am I saying B7? That's this torpedo bomber, it's B5N, but the A7, and I think the AA also improved upon that, but it didn't matter, because after 43, the Japanese were lacking experienced pilots, so put a novice pilot into a good plane really doesn't make up for against the Americans, who had 26 Essex class, while the Japanese only had like 3 aircraft carriers or 4 operating at that time, and they were losing economically, industrially, whatever you want to say it. But early in the war, they were one of the most amazing carrier fleets in the world, and I really do admire their ability to have that such superiority over other nations. And this is very surprising for the Westerners, because a lot of Westerners thought that the Japanese had no chance to actually winning against any of them, since they were pretty much considered novice after their Industrial Revolution in 1865 or 60s. So they had only 100 years to catch up, but they were able to do it. So applaud to them. Other than that, the Hinomaru, another fact about the Hinomaru is that the Hinomaru was ironically used as a bullseye for the Americans during the Battle of Midway, so a lot of dive bombers actually dropped their bombs on the Hinomaru, which pretty much left the ship damaged. So let's talk about the legend. Now, the legend behind the Hiryu, even though she lived a short life in World War II, only 6 months, right, into war in Battle of Midway, she was the last aircraft carrier standing in Battle of Midway before they scuttled her, because the United States of America sunk the other 3 carriers, but this carrier was heavily damaged, but it was not usable anymore, and she was really out of planes, and the deck was completely destroyed, so you can't really take planes off the deck or fly them off. So the Japanese had no choice but to scuttle her, and this is where it gets interesting. The Japanese has hold a big code of the Bushido. Bushido is a culture for the Japanese for a long time. When it comes to warfare, Bushido is an art. This takes all the way back to the samurai. If you know anything about the Japanese military, or at least get a stereotype about them, but we always hear that Japanese like to use the word dishonorable or honorable, or seppuku, which is suicide due to some horrible act, and protecting their name or whatever it is. But the admiral, which was the rear admiral and the captain, Rear Admiral Tomo Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku, they were devastated after the Battle of Midway, which was a battle they should have won. They actually had a slight edge over the Americans, but like I said, there were many things going on at Midway, and one of the reasons was that the American was able to crack the Japanese code, giving them intelligence of where these aircraft carriers are at. But the Hiryu was, after getting struck, they were going to go for like another round of battle against the American, but there was no point. It was late at night, and there's no chance of actually taking the plane off the deck. Like I said, the deck had a huge hole in the Hinomaru spot. So, knowing for a fact that if Yamaguchi and Kaku go back to Japan, it would be considered dishonorable, or rather a bad image for them. And Yamaguchi was up there with Yamamoto, and Yamamoto is the #1 man in the Japanese fleet. This is interesting because Yamaguchi and Kaku, they were evacuating the Hiryu with all her crew that was left on the decks to a destroyer. Yamaguchi told his crew that he is not going back, and same as Kaku, who actually followed in the steps of Yamaguchi. This is one of the reasons why the Japanese lost the war, because they have lost many great generals or great commanders. But Rear Admiral Yamaguchi said that it is his responsibility, really is, that if his carriers has failed him and the carrier's gonna go down, he's gonna go down with the aircraft carrier. And this really hits a lot of his crew, because it is a very heroic act to actually suicide with the carrier. And Kaku also felt responsible for it, and for Westerners, from a Westerner view, that must be really stupid, because, you know, the United States of America have this doctrine to say that leave no man behind. But in this case, Yamaguchi and Kaku volunteered to stay behind the Hiryu, and after they had stayed behind the Hiryu, Yamaguchi and Kaku had a very poetic or legendary story, which the crew went back to Japan talked about, and they said that Yamaguchi and Kaku, in the night, because during the night, it was after like the battle, so they're gonna go for another round for the next day, which was expected, but that's not gonna happen. But during the night, the moon has shined upon the decks of the Hiryu. Yamaguchi and Kaku has contemplated their life, their reasoning, their responsibility, and their loyalty to the Japanese fleet. And they were proud to serve under the flag of Japan and the emperor, which was a religious figure in Japan. So if he can't go back with the ship, he's not gonna go back as a person, because his ship was everything he had. It is part of his soul, or his life as a Navy admiral. It is really his pride and joy, same as Kaku, which was a captain. He was a captain. So they drank sake, I believe, under the moonlight, and really in a happy way to die for Japan. And after that, he ordered the destroyer that was used to evacuate the crew to scuttle the ship. And if you don't know what scuttling a ship, basically he which is Yamaguchi and Kaku, basically stay on the deck or tie themselves onto the ship. The crew radio in, drop the torpedoes, and finish the Hiryu off. And both of them sunk with the ship, die on that day. And that is pretty cool story. I think that's one of the naval legends in my opinion, because they're just not, there are stories out there, but this is one of them. This is one of the most interesting stories out there. There's stories of battles, stories about what Captain did, like the Enterprise rudder shifting so hard to the point that she actually dodged a torpedo. But this story, probably one of my most favorite stories from the Japanese Navy. Aside from that, the Hiryu, the gameplay is definitely nice, so I'm gonna show you guys. But I want to make one message out there. Due to the fact that aircraft carriers are the smallest base population, I fear that they will be gone in the future. Majority of players out there want aircraft carriers out of this game. They want it to be more of a cruiser and battleship and destroyer engagement with their cannons and torpedoes rather than having planes in the sky. And it's a shame because aircraft carriers, like I said, they're one of the pinnacle or pivotal part of the naval fleet during World War II. They hold so much information about how they defeat other ships. They have so many things, and it is probably one of the most toughest job. You're sitting on an aircraft carrier. If you're the pilot, you know for a fact that if you're going to dive into a ship, you're going to be engaging anti-air or get shot down by a plane, and that's really rough because you're out in the open sea, and once you get shot down, you're left behind. Or if you get lucky enough to actually be saved, if you're on the carrier, you're sitting on thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, thousands of pounds of torpedoes and dive bombs loaded on the ship. So when somebody actually fires a salvo onto your aircraft carrier or drop a torpedo and hits that is a huge detonation. And you also have to include the fuel for the ship to actually get there, because these aircraft carriers were designed to be a long-range engagement ship. So aside from that, my message is that I'm gonna stand with the aircraft carriers because I believe they deserve the opportunity to actually play aircraft carriers. They're one of the most important part of World of Warships. Even though aircraft carriers have a poor reputation, a lot of people hate them because the way they are able to take them down. But the reality is, I really do believe in aircraft carriers, and I will stand by them against any adversary or any problem. And for all the other American or Japanese aircraft carrier players, we all stand along each other and play aircraft carriers because we love aircraft carriers. And as for me, I do love battleships as number one, but aircraft carriers are up there. And I just don't believe that aircraft carriers should die. Maybe many people will disagree with me, but these carriers are really amazing ships, and just to get rid of them just due to the fact that people don't like RTS style, or they hate aircraft carriers, dying from an aircraft carrier basically, that's why they would hate, or your teammates aircraft carrier doesn't do a good enough job to protecting them. It's just really sad to see aircraft carriers die, and every day there's always one less aircraft carrier player out there. I can barely find a match with the Shokaku anymore, so that's why I like playing the Hiryu. Aside from that, without further ado, let's get in the game that I have prepared for you guys. Alrighty, you guys, this is the game that I want to share with you. Probably one of the best games, or if not epic games, that I post on this channel. So before my crew can actually take off, they're gonna drink some sake and pray, because most likely they're not gonna make it back to the carrier. Now the game is 2-on-2 against a Lexington and Ranger. Fighting alongside with me is the Shokaku. So this is really a classic battle of American versus Japanese carrier. Now the Lexington is running the 0-1-3, meaning that 0 fighters, 1 torpedo bomber, and 3 dive bombers. The Ranger, which is the carrier that I'm gonna focus, since he is really the same tier as me, is running the 1-1-1 setup, meaning that he has 1 fighter, 1 torpedo bomber, and 1 dive bomber. The Shokaku, I believe, is running the 2-2-2 setup, which is probably the most logical setup, and is exactly similar to mine, but he has way better planes than mine since he is tier 8. But the first thing I do is send my fighters out. I think it's very important to send your fighters first because they are the fastest plane to actually get into the air, and they also give you very good intel. Intel is the number one thing you want to do as a carrier, in my opinion. Some players tend to send their torpedo bombers first since they are the slowest ship. I mean, not the slowest ship, but the slowest plane to actually service and get to their destination. So they want to get their damage source out first. But I think it's ideal to actually scout and get intel, because if the enemy carrier goes for the carrier takeout in the first wave, that's very bad because you don't want to die early in the match. If you die too early in the match, then the other carrier, which is the Shokaku on my side, will be double teamed by the Lexington and Ranger, giving those two carriers air superiority. So I send my fighters to the borders to scout for any sneaking torpedo bombers or dive bombers. Now I spotted the torpedo bomber and the dive bomber by the Ranger and also the fighter. Now we do have the fighter advantage since we have much more fighters. If the Lexington ran the 202 or the 211 setup, then we probably have a lot of problems. But in this case, the Lexington chooses to go full-on offensive with his 013 loadout. Now I'm trying to find a target, a ideal target. While I'm at it, I'm going to take out this torpedo bomber since the Ranger chooses to be reckless about using his torpedo bomber. But it's always ideal to find a target that's alone, and that's what carriers tend to go for, finding a lonely target. Now when I send my torpedo bombers and my dive bombers all the way to the edge, it's mainly because I want to create the element of surprise, which the Japanese are very good at when it comes to aerial attacks. So the element of surprise means that I don't want the enemy team spot my planes. Even if my planes are not in combat zone, and if they get spotted, then it gives you a general idea, actually, a really general idea where the planes are going. So I'm going to prevent that from happening, and in this case, I was able to spot a AFK North Carolina. So with my torpedo bombers first, I'm going to try to go for the torpedo run, and I noticed that I got spotted by the situational awareness. But the planes that actually spot me are fighters, so I'm not too concerned. And I send my fighters over there to deal with that only fighter, which is from the Ranger. Torpedo bomb is going in for the manual drop. The manual drop is much more accurate than the automatic drop. It's actually a gamble from dropping from this distance. The farther you drop, the tighter the spread. So I went for the gamble. And also due to the fact that North Carolina has a very high rating of AA, if I get there too close, drop the bomb too close, then they will shoot more planes down. Unfortunately, the North Carolina resumes the game. So I started to pray that if I can get a flooding, and in this case, there is no flooding. Now, if the North Carolina actually flood, I'll wait for him to actually damage control the flood, and then go in with my dive bombers and pray that I get 2 fire set. If I can get 2 fire set, then it will do a lot of damage. But in this case, the North Carolina was able to damage control the, well, he doesn't have any flooding, but he could damage control my dive bombers. So there's really no point of me trying to go for the North Carolina unless he's the owner target. So I choose to go for the Ranger with my dive bombers, mainly because if you set the decks on fire, then the Ranger won't be able to send his planes out. But then again, his damage control will just clean it up right after. But like I said, I prefer the Ranger over the North Carolina since the North Carolina has superb AA, and also the North Carolina has damage control to follow up with the repair, making the attack kind of useless. But if I can actually damage the Ranger early in the match, maybe it might be useful into late game. Now, judging from the score, it seems to be that the enemy team has gained the advantage. So I'm going to go for the manual dive bomb drop, since manual is much more accurate than the automatic. The A's are going off on the Ranger. And leading my dive bombers into the Ranger's deck. Set 2 fires, which is pretty good. If only he didn't have damage control, then it would have been perfect. But in this case, my dive bomber, my 8th squadron, was not able to make it home. Actually, my 6th squadron, my 7th, is about to make it home. Only 1 survivor. So now I'm just trying to scout what's going on, get a good idea where the ship placement is. My mini-map is actually really big, if you guys are curious. The reason why my mini-map is big is because one of the things about carriers is that it is very important to have map awareness. And I learned this from League of Legends, if you guys ever played League. But map awareness is very important skill. I think that in every game that I play, if there's ever a map, then it's probably important to have that map out. So with the map out, I got a general idea of where the battleships and where the aircraft carriers are at. I know for a fact that the North Carolina is near the east side and he was half health, but probably repairing with his health thing, the little consumable. In this case, I'm going to try to finish off the North Carolina since he's still alone. The Fubuki is trying to go for the North Carolina also. Wow, he actually snatched that, I think it was that destroyer? That was a pretty nice torpedo run by the Fubuki. I didn't even see that when I first watched this. Now, like I said, there's only 1 fighter squadron, and that's the Rangers. So I didn't realize this until halfway through the game, since the Lexington is focused on the left side of the map, which is the west. Later on, I will start focusing the west, but for now, the east, mainly because there's not many ships on the east that are grouped up. If there's ever a group of ships, it's not a good idea. You always want to go for the ships that are not grouped up or battleships that are alone, unless you think you can actually take out the battleship even though there are cruisers around them. Now in this case, I went for the North Carolina because the North Carolina is one of the major ships to take out. Send my fighters to take out the torpedo bombers. Gonna group up my torpedo bombers and dive bombers. Focusing on the main map, I noticed that the Ranger is moving his fighters to the west because of the Shokaku's attack. So my planes are ready, getting ready for the attack. North Carolina seems to be alone. My fighters has taken out that torpedo bomber squadron. So far I've shot down 12 planes, which is pretty nice for this setup. Now there is a Mogami right there, and this Mogami will interrupt my attack big time. So this is probably my first mistake as not being the best aircraft carrier player out there. But my mission is to take out that North Carolina, and it is very important and advantageous to do it. Now noticing on the scoreboard, if you guys haven't noticed, 255 points against 510. The enemy fleet has double amount of ships almost, so this is bound to be a disastrous game since things are looking bleak. The Mogami pop is defensive fire. I'm gonna still go for the North Carolina since I'm committed. Once you're committed with the attack, you gotta go for it unless you're gonna leave your planes up in the sky and get ripped to shreds by AA. So at least do something, use them. A lot of players tend to panic when this situation happens, but in this case, I didn't panic, I just went for the attack. Fortunately, I lost one full squad of torpedo bombers, and I believe this one will make it home. Dive bombers are sliding right past there, so I decided to send my fighter over there. Now the AA on the Mogami defensive fire is still going off for about 40 seconds. That's a very important knowledge you should know when it comes to playing aircraft carriers. Two important knowledge you should know is the 40 seconds AA defensive fire and your enemy carriers, what they run. So I know everything. The Ranger runs the 111 setup, like I said. The Lexington runs the 013. Ranger can run the 013 also. For air superiority, 202. But in this case, I went for the Ranger over the North Carolina because of the 40 seconds of defensive fire. There's really no point of me trying to go for that North Carolina unless I wait for that Mogami's defensive fire to go away. So I went for the Ranger again and harassed him with the dive bombers. I might as well do it since dive bombers are not the main source of damage. The only time the dive bomber can actually do damage is actually when you set fires, and if you set 3 fires, you hit the bullseye. So both my dive bombers has died. Like I said, my crew gotta pray and drink sake before they even go for the attack, because they're probably not gonna make it home alive. Actually, not probably, but most likely, to be more exact. So I still got plenty of planes in reserve. Well, not necessarily a lot, but there's still a good amount of torpedo bombers and dive bombers I can use. I try to exhaust as much planes at this moment since we are losing pretty badly. Just look at the score and the amount of ships we have. It got even worse. So me and Shokaku are on the west side of the map, and I decided that since both me and Shokaku are on the west side, we should start focusing the west. Now what's on the west? Well, I think earlier in the match there was a lot of ships in the west, but now the ships are spread out. Now I do notice that Lexington is alone, and most likely a lot of you guys probably think, why don't I go for your Lexington? Well, one thing is that Lexington has really good AA. Another thing is that Lexington is a tier 8 ship, so most likely I won't be able to kill Lexington. Lexington is also one of the most tankiest aircraft carriers, and it's tough to kill. So a combination of that is not a good idea, and it's pretty much a waste of plane. So the ideal target is the New Mexico, since he is a battleship and he is also alone. Now at this moment, whenever I try to service my planes or it takes time for my planes to travel, I always try to think up of a plan or plan B. So it's always to keep going, keep your planes in the sky. Don't let them sit on the decks of your aircraft carrier. Always want to keep going. And this is the Japanese style of playing aircraft carriers, because Japanese want to have offensive power. It's all about offensive power. You gotta get those planes up in the air and keep doing bit damage and let no time be wasted. And this is why I really like playing Japanese carriers, because it's really fast paced. So my Shokaku, the Shokaku torpedo bomber is getting caught by that fighter over there on the minimap, you guys can see. But these are the Lexington dive bomber and torpedo bombers. And it's pretty tough to actually kill these planes since Lexington has very powerful planes. And a combination of having tier 7 planes. So one of my fighters actually get caught, and due to the fact that I neglected my attention on the fighter, I was more focused on attacking this New Mexico. And that's what you should really prioritize when you play the Hiryu. Prioritizing the attack, since you're not built to be a defensive or protective carrier compared to the American fighters. I went for the automatic drop because of the way that the manual drop can't actually hit the New Mexico close enough, since the angle, or actually the distance from the border, blocks it, so I couldn't get the manual drop close enough to New Mexico. So I went for the automatic, mainly because automatic actually predicts the distance perfectly. And there's my fighter who got caught, which I was not paying attention. But the automatic drop is actually the safest choice. If you don't have a good chance of taking down a ship with a torpedo, well, you might as well use the automatic drop and do something, because automatic drop will do the calculations and they always guarantee to hit something. If the enemy player actually doesn't know what he's doing, if they continue to sail in a straight line, then you're guaranteed to hit. Rather than actually dumping a manual drop that you're not used to due to the fact that the border is blocking your aim and missing all your torpedoes, which is a major setback. When it comes to playing aircraft carriers, I think it is the number one thing to do is to take your time. And taking your time is to make every run count, because if you fail your run, you did no damage. Your plane's gotta travel about 30 to 1 minute of trying to get back to the decks, refuel, rearm, which takes about, depending on what carrier you play. If you play the Japanese, it takes about 20 seconds or 18 seconds in this case. And then you gotta get your planes to get into the air, while other planes are also in the queue to actually be serviced. So in this case, my planes are servicing to give you guys a good idea how long it takes for a carrier to be prepared for the next attack. Now, dive bomber over there. Gotta send my fighter. Gotta keep my fighters busy. Shokaku. I think Shokaku is still going for the Lexington, and that's not a really good idea, Shokaku. But the Shokaku is a very key player, and he is actually a really good player, so don't get him wrong. Later in the match, you will see why he is actually a good player. Now, the game is actually closing. We're actually slowly catching up, but we're still on the losing end. So this is getting quite nervous for me and Shokaku, since we don't really have a chance of winning unless some kind of miracle happens in this battle. My fighters get caught by the Rangers, and the Ranger fighters are much better than my fighters, even though I talked about how the Japanese A6M are one of the most famous fighters. So I went for the strafe in hopes of trying to take out the Rangers fighter. But in this case, that was a poor strafe, and that was another mistake that I made. Like I said, I'm not the greatest aircraft player out there. I think I should have made the strafe a little bit earlier and farther away from where I was targeting, which gives it a better chance to actually shoot more planes down. And that's what Japanese players do when they try to use their fighters. They sacrifice one fighter against the American fighter and use the second one to strafe and clear out the rest of the fighter. So after my torpedo bomb was able to actually fully service, I was going to go for another run on this New Mexico. Now my other dive bomber is still on the deck. Totally forgot about him. I'm going to leave my dive bombers over there and see if I can actually land a flooding, which in this case, hopefully I can do it. Now those torpedoes are from, I think, was it Shokaku or was it... No, those from destroyers. That's not a Shokaku torpedo. So I'm going to go for the manual drop. And this is actually a pretty good drop. If this New Mexico actually turned into the torpedo direction, then he would probably be able to actually take less hits. But in this case, he doesn't know how Japanese carriers operate. So when he turns to the right, like I said, the Japanese manual drop shaped like a cone, meaning that he's gonna take more torpedoes in his direction. So that was a poor play by him. If he played a Japanese carrier, he probably would figure it out and actually point toward the planes. If I were him, I would point toward the planes and reduce the amount of damage, because anyway, I'm gonna get hit by a torpedo. So I did land a flooding. So now I'm gonna finish off this New Mexico by setting him on fire. So he has damage control to flooding, which leaves him invulnerable to the fire. No, vulnerable to fire, not invulnerable. Vulnerable to the fire. Going in for the dive bomb attack. My crew is going from the front. This is a pretty tough attack. Gonna go for the manual at the last second. I used the automatic to actually position my planes. Land one fire, but that should be enough because he's really low. Now, if it was two fire, it would have ended his life much quicker. And you guys notice that the Lexington is nearby, and his AA was able to actually kill a couple of my planes, even though that's considered fairly far. Now, judging from the score, we are still losing by a marginal difference. But then, again, I was able to sink the New Mexico, and we went from 300 to 600 to 400 to about almost 600. So, we're slowly catching up, and the game is coming to a close. The time is ticking, and me and Shokaku gotta work fast. We gotta do something. Now, the Lexington is alone on the west, and like I said, not a good idea to go for a Lexington unless you have really nice planes. In this case, I am tier 7. Lexington has godly AA. Not gonna bother with it. I'm gonna find a different target. And I spotted the Admiral Hipper over there. So I'm sending my fighters to actually kill this dive bomber. Now, on the top right corner of the map, you guys can see that the Mogami is nearby. That was the Mogami early in the match that was shooting down my planes to save the North Carolina. So I didn't realize that until now, like sometime later, that the Mogami is nearby. And that should have been #1 priority, is to protect your friendly carrier or yourself from danger. And I started to notice that the Mogami is nearby. So I'm going to grab my torpedo bombers and go for the Mogami. Now, if I didn't kill this Mogami, well, I'm about to kill it, so spoiler alert. But I'm going to go for the kill on this Mogami because Mogami is a threat. And even though he's not shooting at me, it is a good idea to have awareness of him. Like I said, map awareness is very important. So Shokaku is getting some damage from Mogami, which is why I sent my torpedo bombers over here. Notice that Shokaku took some damage. I'm going to position my torpedo bombers before I even attack Mogami, because Mogami has pretty nice AA also. Not as good as the American AAs, but she is still a high tier cruiser, and she is tier 8, meaning that she's capable of shooting all my planes in one try. So Mogami is in a favorable position for me, so I'm going to go for the run on the side. Now his A was going up, but now it's gone due to the fact that he used the A on the Shokaku earlier, so his defensive fire is pretty much useless against this run. Now I'm too busy with all the other stuff going on, but I do drop my torpedoes. I was really not expecting to actually sink the Mogami, because Mogamis and all other crews are able to maneuver many torpedoes attack that I have experienced. But in this case, Mogami was able to get hit by several torpedoes, which saves the Shokaku and me in a desperate situation. Now time is ticking. The North Carolina that earlier in the match that I was attacking has made his move finally towards the flag. Now we gotta get a kill right away in order to cut the difference. So I would decide to go for the Admiral Hipper, which was ideally I would go for him, but one thing that Admiral Hipper, if you guys can guess, is defensive fire, making my dive bombers completely useless, and I should just went for the North Carolina instead. But I went for the Admiral Hipper simply because of his low health state. So my dive bombers went in, all 8, all miss, unfortunately. And that those two were very close. If you guys look really closely to that other 2 dive bombs that were dropped, couldn't get anything. So me and Shokaku got 30 seconds to find a ship, or pretty much get 60 points to actually win the game or somewhat make something happen. So it looks like this is game, and I hope you guys enjoy this epicness and how intense it is. Sorry to disappoint you guys that it is a defeat, but it was quite an interesting game. Wait a second. Oh no, the clock is ticking. Wait a second, Shokaku?
Waypoint reached.
What was that? 4, 3, 2, 1. And that is why I said that this was one of the most epic, intense, unbelievable ending game I ever played. Shokaku was able to earn us the final points in order to win the game. If Shokaku didn't kill him, then we would have lost. If he didn't land a torpedo on that North Carolina, I had to give it to him, because as a small population base of carriers, me and the Shokaku got this connection of trying to win, and we did a perfect job synchronizing our attacks, and that was one of the most epic, best game I played on World of Warship. I really did lie to you guys. Normally I don't lie to people, but I already caught you guys on the edge for that game. It would have been a defeat, a disappointing defeat, but in this case we were able to grab the victory, and I hope you guys enjoy this game whether you play aircraft carriers or you don't. But you must admit, that was one of the most closest game that I ever post on this channel. Aside from that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is Admiral Tori, and I'll see you guys next time on World of Warships.